In your book, I don't know which volume it is, but it discusses the two donkey fulfillment. And
Right.
is it not true that in one book it actually says one and the other one says two? How does that all work?
I tell you the truth, I didn't read my book yet, so I can't tell you for sure. I hear it's really good, and but I didn't really read it yet. So I'm planning to do that, and then I'm going to. The answer is yes. But okay, so the answer is that there's a prophecy, a messianic prophecy in Zechariah chapter 9, verse 9. And in that prophecy, we are told that, I'm paraphrasing, that rejoice, O Jerusalem, sing, for, beholding, describes the Messiah coming in on a on a on a on a donkey, the foal of a on the donkey, the foal of a horse. I mean, essentially, what we're brought into view is that the Messiah is going to come in essentially from the Mount of Olives and come into Jerusalem on a donkey. But there's a unique kind of language used in this passage, and Matthew didn't get it, and the other Gospels did get it. I think what most people do is they look at this as, there's a contradiction in the New Testament. How many donkeys did Jesus ride in on? Okay? But really, it tells us more about how the stories are developed rather than that there's a contradiction between Matthew and Luke, as an example. With Matthew, we have the triumphant entry into Jerusalem, and according to Luke, comes in on one because Luke reads the text correctly, and according to Matthew, it comes in on two. So Matthew doesn't read it right. But the point is, what we really have is an insight into how the stories in the New Testament were written. That's the key part. The key part is that if you go to Matthew 21, verse 1 through 7, so what you find there is Jesus says to his disciples, go to the village, right? And you'll find a donkey tied up with a colt with her. Loose them, bring them to me. Okay, so that's Matthew 21, verse 1 through 7. You compare that with Luke chapter 19, verse 29 through 35. So what they're doing is they're reading the text in Zechariah, and this is a technical term called prophecy historized, which means that both of these gospel writers want to have Jesus do this. Okay, they both want to have Jesus fulfill Zechariah 9:9, which says, "Be happy, O daughter of Zion, shout." Why? Because your king is coming. He is coming just. He is victorious, humble. He's riding a donkey, the foal of a donkey, a colt, the foal of a donkey. Now, this kind of language where you have it looks like a double language, but in biblical literature, this is called a synonymous parallelism, which means you can have two lines and one essentially repeats the first line but sort of rephrases it slightly. So Matthew doesn't know how to read the text of Zechariah 9:9. He thinks that, no, this must be two animals. So he writes his story having Jesus literally straddling two animals. Luke knows we don't know who wrote Luke, but whoever wrote Luke knew enough to ask and realize that this is one animal. So in Luke 19 has Jesus come in to Jerusalem on one animal. And again, most people take a somewhat sophomoric approach. And that approach is, a contradiction in the New Testament. Well, it is a contradiction, but that's not what we're after. What we're after is we can see now how the authors of these books, the gospel writers, how did they construct their stories about Jesus? They wanted to have Jesus fulfill messianic prophecies. Now, they couldn't have Jesus bring about world peace because you can't invent world peace. People would know it. You can't have Jesus rebuild the temple, which is described at the end of Ezekiel chapter 37 because you can't build a temple, right? You can't bring about the ingathering exiles because, after all the Jews had been exiled to every part of the Roman Empire. You can't bring about the resurrection of dead because you can't get dead people in a cemetery to get out of their grave. You can write in Matthew's passion narrative that, in fact, dead people walked out of their grave, but you can't write that kind of thing, that there's a mass resurrection of the dead. So you can make up the universal knowledge of God, but you can write a story that Jesus rode into Jerusalem on a donkey.
Mm-hmm.
You can have him fulfill Zechariah 9:9. So Matthew looks at the text. His knowledge of Hebrew is limited. He's looking at what's called a synonymous parallelism, where essentially you have this type of linguistic structure is common throughout the Jewish scriptures. He thinks it's two animals. He then writes his story with two animals. Luke gets it. He asks someone, explain this passage to me, and he finds out it's only the Messiah is supposed to come in on one animal, and he writes a story that way. The key is, I don't want the viewers, the listeners, to go, oh, here's a contradiction in the New Testament. No, that's the wrong approach here. The correct approach here is to say, now I see how the stories in the Christian Bible were fused together, were forged, were created, how they were assembled. They went to the Jewish Bible, they found anything that could be construed that they could say Jesus did, and then they wrote the story that Jesus is doing it. That's the key point that I think people should look at when they're comparing these two passages I mentioned in Matthew 21 right at the beginning versus Luke 19 towards the end.
What do you say to the person who just says, well, I think the rabbi is making this up, and I don't think it really matters whether one said one and one said the other. The point was that he did ride it on a donkey. So, because so many people think that way, they think, well, they look at it as the synoptic gospels, or the, you put four people witnessing one event and they all give you different aspects of it. But from what I've seen personally, like you've illustrated quite well, is it's not that they're giving fill-in pieces that make that perfect puzzle. It's more that they're giving opposing pieces that won't work. It doesn't fit. Something's wrong with that. But to the person who thinks that you're making this up and that I'm making this up, how do you even approach responding to that?
What I always say to people who are listening, I want you who are viewing, who are listening to the show, look it up for yourself. And that's Matthew 21, 1-7, versus Luke 19, verse 29 through 35. That means go to your Christian Bible and look them up side by side. And you'll see that, in fact, they don't correspond. Matthew has two animals brought to Jesus and Jesus placed on them. And in Luke, Jesus is riding in on one animal. Each one is trying to fulfill Zechariah chapter 9, verse 9. But I have news for you, William, and that is, it is not that important to most Christians that there's a mistake in the Synoptic Gospels. I don't know of a single Christian that will say, you know what, I'm going to leave Christianity because there's a mistake in the New Testament.
Sure.
And therefore, I don't want people to say, okay, I'm going to share this with someone and who's a Christian, and that's going to affect them. It really won't. In fact, it's going to offend them. Christians recognize that mistakes happen. Maybe a scribe made an error. Maybe there was some people don't. That's not why people leave Christianity. I wouldn't. That's not the approach that I would use.
Sure.
What I would say is the following, and that is, if you look at the next passage, remember we've been talking about Zechariah 9:9 quite a bit here. Interestingly, almost no Christian is familiar with the passage that follows it, which is Zechariah 9:10. And what's important about Zechariah 9:10 is it begins with the word "and," which means it's a continuation of the previous verse. And sometimes you ask folks who are Christians, well, what does it say in the next verse? Well, the next verse, it says that that God is going to remove the chariots from Ephraim, the horses from Jerusalem. War will be removed, and there will be peace in all nations. That is the following verse. That's Zechariah 9:10. No Christian, almost no Christian knows that passage. So the key is you can write a story having Jesus coming on one donkey, two donkeys, whatever, however that mistake happened. It's very clear. Matthew misread the text. But
Sure.
I want to go beyond that, and that is, wait, what happened to Zechariah 9, verse 10? Because the text continues, this passage continues to tell us that when this occurs, there will be peace from one end of the world to the other, and his rule will be from the sea, from the west to the river, to the ends of the earth. That clearly did not occur. So what I'd say to folks is, yes, this is what's interesting about Matthew and Luke is not if there's a mistake or not. I think most Christians actually are put off by that. I think it does give us insight into how the stories in the New Testament were constructed. However, Zechariah 9:9 is really the introductory passage to verse 10. Riding a donkey is not what's relevant here. It's not what is central. The central part is the peace on earth that will follow. Incidentally, I just want to just make a point. Why is it so important the Messiah is going to ride in on a donkey? Like, why a donkey? Like, who cares? Like, why isn't the Messiah riding in on a horse? Why is he riding in on a donkey? That's really an important question. Well, the answer is that a horse is an animal that represents war. No one went to war riding donkeys because they can't run as fast as horses.
Sure.
Follow? Okay. So what is a donkey? A donkey is an animal of labor. A donkey is a very durable animal. A donkey you can leave out in the rain if you know anything. You don't need to put it in a barn. It doesn't get scared easily. When you take those trips down the Grand Canyon or up the Himalayas, they use donkeys because these are animals that are very durable. They can eat just about anything. Horses require very refined. So a horse is a symbol of war, and a donkey is a symbol of peace. Now we know so much more about Zechariah 9 through 10. The Messiah comes on a donkey. Why? Because he's coming to speak peace. And look at the next verse. I removed the chariots from Ephraim and the horses from Jerusalem. That's the war. Now I understand the passage. See, Zechariah 9, verse 10 is so delicious. It helps us understand verse 9. It brings light. It sheds light in verse 9. Why is he coming on a donkey? Who cares? Let's say he's coming on a giraffe. What is the importance here? Well, the donkey is very important. It's the only non-kosher animal that one has to give for the firstborn. It's the Saul himself was a herder of donkeys, and donkeys is a symbol of peace, labor, agriculture, whereas horses are the animals of war. So it's really, this is so exquisite. Beyond, okay, so there's a contradiction between Matthew and Luke. That's not what's central here.